Fill in the blank. For by blank you have been saved. What'd you put? What did you put in the blank? Did you put faith? Did you put grace? Did you put something else? We've been trained to hear faith and grace most often in that blank. For by faith you've been saved. For by grace you've been saved. Very interesting. There's two other times besides the one that we're so familiar with that use this same phrase but with different word in the blank. One time it's for by hope you have been saved. Another time, almost strangely, for by childbirth you have been saved. What's that one all about? Well, I'm not going to get into that one, but let me say to you that you probably will not find those phrases if you try to look them up in your concordance in your English Bible. Why? Because we have been so influenced by the Reformation. Luther taught us to say, we are saved by grace through what is it? Through faith. And so faith has become for us the epitome of salvation, of our salvation story. Faith is so, so important. And because of that, most modern translations, when it comes to the same exact phrase in Romans says, for by hope. It's changed. It doesn't say that. Because somehow our cognitive framework under the influence of the Reformation says, oh, it can't mean that. It must mean, and they'll translate usually, for in this hope you were saved. And so it's not by hope anymore, but by faith still. Interesting. Interesting how our history teaches us how to read the Scriptures. So we're going to focus in on this, in this lesson, in this video, on faith and faithfulness. We'll begin by looking at the word that is translated faith, and look at the word group there. Then we'll look at faith in the Synoptic Gospels, rather to say faith in the Gospels, and compare the Synoptic perspective with the perspective of John. We'll look at faith in the Pauline Epistles, and then we'll also look at faith in the book of Hebrews. There are two closely related words in the New Testament Greek, related to the idea of faith. The first one is Pistis. The second one sounds a lot like it. It's pistuo. They're related words. One is the noun, pistis, and one is the verb, pistuo. Pistis occurs 243 times in the New Testament, but it's very interesting to note that pistis, one word, comes into English in two words. That is, it can be faith, but it can also be faithfulness. So for us, faith is somehow an attitude, an idea, very, very abstract. Faithfulness is a little more concrete for us. It is consistency over a long period of time. Faithfulness. Yeah. But in Greek, same word for both of those ideas. Very important for us as we try to understand what's the meaning of this word group in the New Testament. The verb form pistuo is simply meaning believe, or usually translated believe. It occurs 241 times in the New Testament. So also very, very common word in the New Testament. We don't always think of those two words in English, faith and believe, as so closely related. But in Greek, they're very, very closely related. They're the same root word. So when we look at this word group in the New Testament, especially in the Gospels, first of all, I want to show you this graphic that lays out where we see pistis. It's the words there marked in red, and pistuo. Remember, pistis is the noun, and pistuo is the verb. What do you notice when you look at this at this graph or this chart. Where do you find Pistis? You find Pistis only in the Synoptic Gospels. And where do you find pistuo? Very, very heavily in the Gospel of John. In fact, you'll see that the noun form is never used in John at all. So very interestingly, we can say that for John, faith is something that you do. It's a verb, exclusively verb. It's not something that you assent to. It's not something that you assent to, but it is something that you accomplish. We can look a little bit closer, and I invite you, in fact, to turn off the video in a moment and look up these verses. Look up Matthew chapter 9, verses 28 to 30, Matthew 13, 54 to 58, Mark 6, 1 to 5, Luke 17, 5 to 6, and Luke 17, 12 to 19. Looking up these key passages in the Synoptic Gospels. Go ahead and turn me off. Read those. When you've studied them for a little bit, come back and I'll talk a little bit more about those. So did you enjoy reading those verses? Did you notice that faith is a prerequisite for miracles? Jesus couldn't do very many miracles, he says, because the people didn't have faith. So faith is required first and then miracle. Let's look at John. Again, turn me off in just a moment and read these verses in John. John chapter 2, verses 1 to 11, chapter 6, verses 26 to 30, and chapter 20, verses 24 to 31. As you read these passages, notice that it's really almost the exact opposite of what we see in the Synoptic Gospels. Here, the miracles are signs that produce faith. So in Synoptic Gospel, faith comes first, then the miracle. Can't be otherwise, or almost can't be otherwise. But here in John, it is completely otherwise. The miracle comes first, and that produces faith. So who's right? The Synoptics or John? You can see these are very much in tension. What do we do with this kind of tension? Well, I want to suggest that we can hold them in tension. We can see them as complementary views. Faith first and after miracle can be complementary. And I want to take you to Mark chapter 9, verse 24. Very, very important verse. Remember, the Father had come to Jesus and first to his disciples and asked them to cast out the demon from his son. And they weren't able to do it. And then he came to Jesus. And Jesus says, well, do you believe? And his response, so good. I believe. Help my unbelief. Ah, yeah, isn't that the way of it? Yeah, we have this grain of mustard seed faith. It's just maybe we can call it incipient faith. It's a faith, but boy, it sure needs growth. But that can be enough. Huh? And then when the miracle comes, wow, our faith grows. So it can be this cycle of faith producing miracle. Not directly, but faith coming first and then miracle. And then miracle producing faith. And that allows us to have faith for another miracle, which produces our faith, which increases our faith all the more. But God in his wisdom orchestrates the signs according to the faith according to the signs, to bring about his perfect plan. Let's look at faith in the Pauline epistles. Again, I invite you to turn me off in a moment. I want you to read these verses. Romans 3:26, Galatians 2:16, Galatians 2:20, Galatians 3:22, Ephesians 3:12, and Philippians 3:9. Go ahead and shut me off. Come back when you've read those ones. Did you find the common phrase in those passages? You should have noticed the phrase, well, it's translated in different ways because it's a little bit hard to translate. But it's always translating the Greek word pistis. Remember pistis? Pistis is the Greek word for faith or faithfulness. Pistis Christou, which means, word by word, literally, faith of Christ. Or perhaps faithfulness of Christ. That's just the first level of trickiness on how to translate this phrase. Is it talking about faith of Christ or faithfulness of Christ? Now bear with me as we get a little bit more technical. I'll try to make it clear, but it's still a little bit technical, because what we're dealing with here is a Greek phrase. Christou is a particular type of Greek word. If you ever get a chance to study Greek, wow, it's so rewarding. But let me just dabble in it a little bit here in a way that hopefully won't scare you off from doing Greek later on. Christou is in a particular form of the word of meaning Christ called genitive. And when a word is in the genitive, we often translate it of Christ. We sometimes say in English it's possessive. That's not exactly right, but think about this. If we translate this, faith of Christ, what does of mean? We think of, such a simple word. Oh, but so powerful and complex in its meanings. What does it mean, faith of Christ or faithfulness of Christ? Well, to give a little help on the vocabulary of this, we can call this subjective genitive or objective genitive. Don't get hung up on the exact term, but you know what a subject is, yeah? A subject is the thing that does the action of the sentence. What's object? That receives the action of the sentence. So we can say faith of Christ. So if it's subjective genitive, the word in the genitive, in this case Christ, does the implied action. So if it's subjective genitive, Christ is the doer of the faith. But objective genitive means the modifying word, in this case again Christ, receives the implied action. So if we say that faith of Christ is, Christ is receiving the faith, then He is the object of faith. Let me give you a little example. When you say love of Christ, or love of God, the love of God, we talk about that, we even sing about it, don't we? The love of God. But that could mean two things. It could mean God's love for us. I'm overwhelmed by the love of God, we might say. God's love for us. That's subjective genitive. God is loving us. But it could also be our love for God. For the love of God, we serve Him. Our love for God. That would be the objective genitive. So when we take a look at this phrase in Paul, you can see why it's so complicated. Because it can be faith or faithfulness. It can be objective genitive or subjective genitive. So we've got two options and two options, making, when 2 by 2 makes four possibilities of how to translate just this one two-word phrase. So usually we boil it down though to two. Faith in Jesus. It's our cognitive assent to Jesus. So we place our faith in Him. Perhaps the word I'm looking for is trust. We place our trust in Him. If that's what it means, faith in Jesus, then we're saved because we place our faith in Jesus. But maybe that's not what Paul is saying here. Maybe Paul is talking about faithfulness of Jesus. That is to say, Jesus is the one, the subject of the faith or the faithfulness. Jesus is the one who does the faithfulness. So we can say, if that's right, we are saved because Jesus was faithful, faithful unto death, even death on a cross. Yeah, Jesus was faithful. He showed us the way, and He won for us an objective, I'm using that word in a different way just here, an objective reality by Him being faithful. So on that view, faith of Christ becomes faithfulness, His faithfulness, what He did. So again, we are not saved by anything that we accomplish, but by what Christ did. Let's turn to the book of Hebrews. To understand faith and faithfulness in Hebrews, I think first of all we have to remember, what is the purpose of Hebrews? Have you ever read the whole book of Hebrews in one sitting? Yeah, I invite you to do that. It's really interesting because the purpose of Hebrews becomes so very, very clear when you read it, not by breaking down all the little parts and studying, but looking at the whole, all at one experience. And when you do that, you will realize that the whole book of Hebrews is focused on one thing. It's focused on exhorting the readers not to apostatize. That is to say, not to turn their back on Christ. Or, to put it in different terms, it is an exhortation to remain faithful to Christ. It is an exhortation to faithfulness. So, from the very beginning, from understanding the purpose itself, we should recognize that faithfulness, not faith, but faithfulness is the key word in Hebrews. Remember that it's the same word in Greek, but two different ideas in our minds. So faithfulness is the key idea in Hebrews. So when we come to Hebrews 11 is famous, sometimes it's even called the Hall of Faith, the people who had great faith. But I want to invite you, reread Hebrews 11. But every time you see the word faith, read instead the word faithfulness. What do you get? Maybe it should be called the faithfulness chapter instead of the faith chapter. Recognizing that these people were faithful. They were faithful people, faithful unto death. They didn't turn their back on God. They were faithful. They're examples of the very thing that the author is so keen to convince the hearers to do, to be faithful. However, I don't want to make the case too strong. I'm really convinced faithfulness must be there. Yes. But I think we can't get rid of faith altogether out of that chapter. Seems to me both ideas are somehow there. So when you reread Hebrews, link it up to the purpose of Hebrews, and you'll see how important is faithfulness in Hebrews. Faith and faithfulness in the New Testament. Really, really important topic for us. Remember that in Greek, it's the same word. Faith, faithfulness, is just one word in Greek. To really be keen interpreters of Scripture, to understand which English word is in the mind of the Greek, because it could have been either one. We need to really pay attention to that. Remember too that in John, we don't find the word faith, but we find the verb form of it. Faith is something that you do. In the Synoptic Gospels, remember that faith produces miracles. But in John, miracles produce faith. They're quite the opposite. And we need to hold those two perspectives in tension to recognize that they can both yield the other. When we looked at Paul, we saw that pistis Christou, can either be Christ's faithfulness to the cross, or it can be our faith or our trust in Him. We need to work on that. The scholars continue to debate that back and forth, and it's not an easy one to decide. Once again, perhaps both are somehow in view. And finally, we looked at Hebrews, especially Hebrews 11. We talked about Hebrews 11 as the hall of faithfulness as much as the hall of faith.